So in this video, I actually want to talk about iPads, and I actually want to compare different iPad models, and I actually want to talk about the creation of the iPad, and I want to talk about where the iPad has officially been ever since the creation of the original iPad. Now you can see in front of you, I do have two different iPads. You can see on the left hand side, I do have the iPad Air 1, and on the right hand side, I do have the iPad Pro 2020 edition. And it's not really a comparison between both of these tablets. It's just that this is the only older iPad I actually had laying around to do for this comparison. So I'm not specifically trying to compare these two. I just want to talk about where iPads have been versus where iPads are at currently in 2020. And let me not beat around the bush here. I just really wanted to say that ever since the creation of the first iPad that came out back in 2010, iPads really haven't evolved all that much from the original creation. You can see there's a lot of years between both of these devices. You can see again, this is the iPad Air 1 and this is the iPad Pro 2020 edition, and you can see the operating system and the form function of the iPad is pretty much identical. Sure, with the iPad Pro, you are getting some nice quality of life improvements over this iPad and even some of the other modern day Apple iPads that Apple currently does sell in the iPad line, of course. And this really does show you that honestly you don't need the top of the line iPad to get some actual functionality out of it, because the one thing Apple really never did with the iPad line is really change iOS. iOS has pretty much been the same throughout the years. If you compare both of these iPads, for instance, the iPad Air 1 versus the iPad Pro 2020 edition, you will notice that they are using the same user interface. Pretty much most of it's the same. Sure, on the iPad Pro 2020 edition, you'll get things like, for instance, iPadOS, and iPadOS does have some pretty significant things inside of it that the iPad Air 1 can't do since it doesn't support iPadOS. But for the most part, they are pretty much identical in form and function, and that's kind of a shame, honestly, if you ask me, just due to the fact that if you look at where iPads are trying to go in 2020, Apple really does think that iPads can replace a modern day computer, whether it be a laptop or a desktop computer. And honestly, it's kind of a shame that Apple really doesn't want to change iOS all that much. iOS is still the same ever since 2010, with just incremental slight improvements to the user interface and to all the little things you can do in iOS. But iOS on iPad is still iOS, unfortunately, and it really does show you that we haven't evolved all that much ever since the first iPad. Sure, the design of the iPad has clearly changed. You can see with the iPad Pro, we almost have no bezels here. They did decide to go with bigger screens for the iPad. We have 11 inches now. We have 12.9 inches now, which this one is the 12.9 inch version of the iPad Pro on the right. But besides that, it's pretty much identical when it comes to user ability. And it's kind of a shame too. You would think after all these years, one of the things they would change, if they're going to go ahead and change the design of the iPad to almost have no bezel, you would think they would want to improve the screen quality, but they really didn't improve the screen quality at all. It's still that Retina LCD display that we've pretty much had for many years now, ever since the iPad 3, I think the new iPad, the iPad 3, was the first one in Apple's lineup to actually introduce the Retina LCD display, and that's pretty much what we're rocking here. If you compare both of these devices, you can see that the displays are almost identical. Granted, the iPad Air 1 doesn't have things like a True Tone display, or it has a gap in between the display and the glass, so it will feel like you're actually touching the glass compared to actually touching a screen, so it is a little bit worse quality. But if you compare this to any other iPads that Apple currently sells, it's kind of like, what's the point of even owning an iPad Pro for all this much money when every iPad that Apple has ever sold pretty much feels all the same to one another? And that's something I'm not really a big fan of, especially again when Apple keeps claiming you can use these as laptop replacements. And I kind of wish after all these years Apple would kind of move away from iOS. I mean, iOS or iPad OS is actually good for touchscreen interaction, so that is actually nice. I just wish they would build another user interface on top of iOS maybe that you can use to make it feel more like a laptop experience, or make it feel slightly different, because I really do think there are a lot of things that Apple could do with the iPad now that the iPad's about 10 years old now, and now that the iPad has matured. You would think they would want to add a whole bunch of new features on the iPad to make especially the iPad Pros worth it, but unfortunately, in my opinion, I really don't feel like the iPad Pro is the end-all be-all device, just due to the fact that the that there are other iPads out there on the market that do exactly the same thing as the top of the line iPad. Whether you buy another cheaper current gen iPad that Apple currently sells, or whether you buy an older iPad from a couple years ago, I just honestly do think that iPads basically haven't evolved all that much ever since the first iPad back in 2010. Anyway, that's pretty much going to do it for this video. Anyway, guys, this is Wayne from My Tech News, signing out.